Do you want water, Gareth?
No. For all the reasons relating to the Australian economy, defence and security discussed, I say that we should eschew leftist ideology and prefer enrichment of our world-leading supplies of uranium, together with plutonium processing for civil nuclear capability, in order to use this loophole under Article 4 of the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so that we can convert to military nuclear capability if this becomes necessary for our survival. I am not favourably disposed towards nuclear technology, and I abhor nuclear weapons. However, Australia's survival in the Asian Pacific region must be ensured. We would be extremely foolish and irresponsible not to join the nations possessing nuclear capabilities short of presently actually developing nuclear weapons for purposes of deterrence to attack. These countries apparently included, as of 2007, 13 capable of enriching uranium. In 2004, Mustafa El-Baradi, as Director General of the International Atomic Agency, stated that 35 to 40 states could have the knowledge required to develop nuclear weapons. It should be remembered that in the Asian area, India, Pakistan, China and North Korea all have nuclear weapons capabilities. In addition, Japan and South Korea both have the capability to quickly develop nuclear weapons in the event of a crisis. Finally, Indonesia has a program for development of nuclear technology underway, which is presently avowedly peaceful and unrelated to its declared intention some years back of developing a nuclear weapon. Unfortunately, of course, possessing nuclear weapons also entails the acquisition of expensive delivery systems. In developing nuclear technology, Australia is not impeded by seismic and volcanic dangers, as is Indonesia, and if Australia's nuclear program were carried out lawfully, bearing in mind Articles 1 and 2 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and discreetly, there should be no danger of strategically destabilizing our region. As regards Indonesia, it should be recalled that in July 1965, President Sukarno publicly declared his support for Indonesian development of a nuclear weapon. But this did not eventuate after General Suharto seized power and agreed to international safeguards, thereby ending, at least for the time being, concerns that Indonesia might develop nuclear weapons. Indonesia signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970. Whether it remains a party thereto or seeks to circumvent the treaty may depend, inter alia, on the increasing size and strength of the Indonesian economy and events in its typically unstable domestic political affairs. The fickleness of Indonesian behaviour is clearly evident in their simultaneous acceptance of billions of dollars of aid from Australia while acting belligerently towards us. Australia's strategic circumstances are similar to those of Israel. We are adjacent to potentially hostile Muslim forces, vastly superior in terms of numbers, strengthening economically and militarily, and we are without the protection afforded by geographic location in a strategic bloc. And I refer there, of course, to Sweden as a good example of a more secure country. Australia's lack of urgency in confronting this potential threat from Asia is symptomatic of a complacent and apathetic, careless, Anglo-Celtic country which has never experienced invasion and most of whose people have never known what it is like to go hungry and to have to survive in their own country. The following extract regarding Indonesia from the Sydney Morning Herald, dated 4th of June 2014, at page 7, should be noted. Quote, "The Deputy Chairman of Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee Tantoi Yahya said Australia's feeling of being different from the region does not fit within today's geopolitical situation. Asia is the world's future, and Indonesia is the most important player in the Australian Pacific region, in the Asia-Pacific region. It's better if Australia doesn't harm its good relations with Indonesia. Australia cannot play the white sentiment game anymore. Australia be warned. This is the voice of an Indonesia looking forward to, quote, flexing its muscles, unquote, in the Asian Pacific region. These words unquestionably, implicitly carry a threat. Some years ago I wrote and submitted to the authorities a lengthy monograph in support of new nuclear reactor capabilities, and at that time nuclear scientists from Lucas Heights, whom I conferred with, were very anxious that Australia's expertise in nuclear technology, particularly enrichment of uranium, was going to be lost. Notwithstanding this, Professor Richard Bronowski, in his 2003 study entitled Fact or Fission, The Truth About Australia's Nuclear Ambitions, stated that the fact is that Australia has the resources and technology to develop its own nuclear weapons. I am pleased but surprised to read this, and I should have asked him to elaborate this statement at a Harvard Club of Australia luncheon we attended at the Union Universities and Schools Club in Sydney a few months ago. It is extremely disappointing that the leaders of both the Australian Liberal Party, with the exception of Sir John Gorton, and the Australian Labor Party, have in the past blocked or failed to advance efforts to develop a potential, not an actual, Australian nuclear weapons capability. Of course, opposition from the Labor Party, Fabian Socialists, Communists, Greens and Aborigines, the latter incited by the Fabians, Communists and the Greens, would inevitably be encountered at the present time. Existing Commonwealth and state legislation blocking enrichment and reprocessing would also have to be repealed. To summarise the essential elements of the foregoing. 1. Because of the greedy and ruthless international push for globalisation, the irrational, bipartisan, neoliberal or economic rationalist policies of our politicians and bureaucrats, and shocking, devious and subversive economic management by Labor governments, Australia's economy and our national security for the future are severely endangered. 2. In view of the likelihood or probability, perhaps certainty, that an economically weakening Australia will be threatened in the future with increasing infiltration of foreign peoples and massive conventional warfare attack, as overpopulated industrializing countries to the north seek living space and mineral and agricultural resources, bearing in mind the uncertainty of continuing American protection, Australia must formulate as soon as possible a strategy for the defence of the nation in the medium to long term. 3. Such defence strategy or planning must include development of the capability for enrichment of uranium and reprocessing of plutonium for civil nuclear purposes, pursuant to the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This expertise being rapidly convertible to a military nuclear capability should our survival be threatened, and not until then. This would also entail the concurrent acquisition of appropriate delivery systems for nuclear weapons. 4. The application of highly theoretical and unrealistic neoliberal or economic rationalist policies by Australian politicians and bureaucrats must cease, and the more pragmatic and commercially oriented approach to economic management of our East and Southeast Asian neighbouring countries should be emulated. This would require a more interventionist and protectionist stance in management of the national economy, with adoption of the minimal amount of necessary and appropriate regulation, management of the exchange rate, control of budget deficits and debt levels, and the rejection of free trade in favour of fair trade principles. Excessive privatisation and competition policy harmful to small business and farmers should be avoided. The result would be the transformation of the Australian economy from Western regulatory capitalist economy to a model approximating that of the Asian-style developmental capitalist economies, and logically a longer federal political cycle of, say, 4 or 5 years would be necessary to accomplish this. 5. Transformation to a developmental capitalist economy would require a review of the Australian federal and federal fiscal systems towards a more centralised system, or at least coercive federalism, in order to achieve a less pluralistic polity able to compete against the single-minded, predatory Asian and other nations in matters of trade and foreign investment, instead of a system speaking with internecine voices as the Australian states presently do. 6. Because neoliberalism has resulted in Australian economic unilateral disarmament in relation to free trade and foreign investment policies and negotiations, Australia faces the prospect of being colonised by foreign countries, essentially as our politicians and bureaucrats refuse to distinguish between foreign investment and foreign ownership. In particular, the Foreign Investment Review Board should be terminated and a new, more substantial and much stricter foreign investment regime instituted. 7. Australia as a transformed developmental capitalist economy must resurrect its dying manufacturing industry in order to maintain its defence capability as well as its standard of living. And it must rebuild its damaged agricultural sector in order to be completely self-sufficient and to minimise its dangerous interdependence with foreign nations. Judicious policies of tariff protection, especially as regards infant industries, subsidisation and import substitution will be necessary in order to achieve these objectives. 8. In order to shift Australian economic management from neoliberalism or economic rationalism to a more pragmatic and commercially oriented model, it will be necessary to reform economics education in Australia as well as the central economic agencies, departments of federal government. It will also be necessary to establish networks for cooperation between politicians, the bureaucracy, industrial institutions and leading corporations, as the Asians, particularly Japan, have done. 9. Australia, together with all the underdeveloped and undeveloped nations, will have to take steps to protect itself from the process of globalisation being forced on the world by the allied forces of world capitalism and world socialism communism, including the sinister and threatening Marxist thrust of the United Nations for world government and the New World Order. 10. A strict review of presently excessively radical Australian immigration policy is required, together with abandonment of the policy of institutionalised, state-subsidised multiculturalism, which is encouraging a separatist tribalism in this country. 11. While preserving healthy and non-corrupt trade unions, consideration must be given as to how the militant and intransigent Australian trade union movement, with its rationale of class conflict and utilisation of adversary process, can be harnessed to support the national interest and the country's defence and security. The same consideration needs to be given to how the country can be protected from the disloyal and unpatriotic minorities, Marxists, socialists and communists, refugee advocates and self-interested refugee lawyers, civil libertarians, do-gooders, bleeding hearts, so-called progressives, and the New Left, and radical, sometimes socialist or communist, Christian clergy, which seem to infest undisciplined, complacent, and apathetic Anglo-Celtic democracies. 12. Whitlam's unlawful creation of a parallel federal constitution and government and institutions, therefore, in the attempt for socialist and communist purposes to destroy Australia's connection with its Christianity-based European heritage, must be investigated and corrected. 13. Australia's political and judicial systems are seriously in need of reform in order to reinstate democratic ultimate control of government by the Australian people under the federal constitution, which has been substantially subverted. In this regard, the prescriptions for reform, particularly the adoption of, quote, direct democracy, unquote, in Professor David Flint's recent book entitled Give Us Back Our Country, should be heeded. 14. Australia must work assiduously at taking its rightful place in the Asian Pacific area, in studied and enlightened harmony and cooperation with its Asian neighbours, while preserving its Christianity-based heritage from Western civilization, including democracy, the rule of law, and welfare for the less fortunate and underprivileged, in defiance of Marxism, Fabian socialism, and communism. In conclusion, let me declare that I will vote for any political party, whether oriented to political left or political right, which will secure Australia's economic and defensive survival in the Asian Pacific area. Thank you.